A lot of people have debated about which Half-Life expansion is the best one, usually comparing Blue Shift and Opposing Force. Today, I'm here to create a new discussion. Is Opposing Force better than Half-Life 1 itself? Now, before you comment, there will be some rules that will apply throughout this video. Number 1, we're going to ignore the fact that Opposing Force couldn't exist without Half-Life. We're going to be taking both games at face value. If someone was to almost blindly play one of the two. I say almost blindly because of rule number 2. Rule number 2, we're going to ignore the fact that Opposing Force makes a lot more sense to play after Half-Life 1. Nobody in their right mind should play Opposing Force without having played Half-Life 1 first. For the sake of the argument, we are going to assume that you have read Half-Life 1 story before and thus know what's going on in Opposing Force. This is all the rules we have. We will be comparing story, looks, all different aspects of gameplay and other general points. Also, be sure to stick around until the end to hear about a very exciting event that you can participate in that is happening tomorrow. For now, let's start off with a very brief history of both games. Half-Life 1 released in 1998 and is highly regarded as one of the most important games of all time. It was one of the first 3D FPS games and especially one of the most immersive games up until this point. It was a revolutionary game release and set a new standard for all video games to come. Opposing Force was one of 3 Half-Life 1 expansions that Valve contracted to Gearbox Software, who you may know as a company that went on to create Borderlands. Opposing Force is seen as the best of the 3. People praise its new gameplay element, its unique take on the Half-Life story, like adding in a whole new race of aliens and your protagonist being an AGCU soldier, the bad guys of Half-Life 1. So let's compare their stories a bit. I'm not here to give a summary, but rather call out what each story does well and doesn't do well. Half-Life 1 has you playing as Gordon Freeman, a scientist of the Black Mesa research facility. Black Mesa is an underground research complex of cartoonish size. The main focus of the experiments here are teleportation. After an experiment that you took part in went wrong, you find yourself stranded in the vast underground corridors of Black Mesa surrounded by creatures of Zen, a border world used in the aforementioned teleportation technology that was being tested. Your only goal now is to escape this facility. Eventually the military arrives, which makes the escape even harder. You eventually move into Zen yourself to take down what scientists think to be the creature that holds open the portal between Earth and Zen. After moving through Zen, you eventually find and kill said creature. You get picked up by the G-Man, an unknown character of seemingly great power that transcends anything humanly possible, who you also saw quite frequently while playing Half-Life. He offers you a job. If you fail to accept, you end up getting killed. If you do accept, then that's the ending. Half-Life 1 has a very creative story that also harmonizes with the new possibilities that the Gold Source engine provided. It created a lot of lore that ended up being the basis for a total of 7 more Half-Life story games. The story is only subtly told through the environment and very occasional conversation with the odd scientist or security guard. The story was told in a new revolutionary way, whereas games previously relied solely on text boxes or characters talking to you in cutscenes to tell stories. Here the player is rewarded for trying to understand what's happening through context clues by learning more and more of the story. Half-Life Opposing Force in and of itself doesn't have a huge amount of story. We are a 22-year-old HGCU soldier named Adrian Shepard that was sent to Black Mesa after the Resonance Cascade. After a plane crashes on the way there, we are now trying to escape again. It is hinted that the G-Man somehow knew the disaster would happen, since we see him in the training levels of this game and there is talk about us having to master indoor combat as quick as possible for operation that will start in as early as a week. We were relatively quickly able to escape Black Mesa again, however our way is blocked by the G-Man. We also get a lot of lore tie-ins to Half-Life 1, like seeing the person on the radio we heard in Half-Life 1 that says the soldiers are pulling out.
Forget about Freeman. We're abandoning the base.
We then fight against a ton of Black Ops soldiers and the new Race X aliens. We also fight other soldiers and team up with them. The game itself features a little amount of story. We do get to see Gordon Freeman jumping into Zen from a new perspective. We also enter Zen ourselves, only to escape again relatively shortly afterwards. We see Black Ops soldiers planting a nuke, which after we deactivate it, it gets reactivated by the G-Man. Eventually we fight off against what seems to be the Nihilant of the Race X creatures, the Gene Worm. We then also get picked up by the G-Man, who puts us into stasis just like he did with Gordon Freeman in case he requires our services in the future. The story doesn't really have a lot happening, mostly piggybacking off of Half-Life story. It does this pretty well, with lots of great tie-ins. It is however also highly discussed if Opposing Force is even canon, due to its introduction of Race X aliens that were never seen again afterwards. While highly controversial, there seems to be no good reason to not just consider it canon. So, while a great story and definitely also great for its time, it did not achieve what Half-Life did, which was revolutionizing a whole industry. There is an argument to be had about pacing though. Half-Life 1 drags on for quite a while, but it is great in most aspects, it certainly isn't for the story. I think more gameplay is always better, but Half-Life 1 is a pretty long game and its later chapters like Zen and Interloper are pretty frustrating and also serve very little to the story. Opposing Force is a pretty short experience, only about a third of the length of Half-Life 1, if I had to give a rough estimate. Opposing Force feels a lot denser and more fleshed out, there is never a dry spot. We will pick up this point again once we get to the gameplay and pacing. The point for story definitely has to go to Half-Life 1 though, simply for the fact that Opposing Force barely has one. Now, let's quickly get the looks out of the way. Since Opposing Force did release a year later and managed to minimize its time in Zen, the point will go to Opposing Force. Also because they played around with the colors a bit more due to Race X portals being a more pinkish color instead of the green one. which added even more fun contrast in the colors. The new aliens, character models and general architecture of the rooms and buildings is generally a lot better than that of Half-Life 1. So looks go to Opposing Force. Though this point isn't really worth as much because they are almost at the same level, and Half-Life 1 revolutionizing the way games look is a fair argument to make. But just taking the games at face value, Opposing Force did do a little better. Now let's get into what I believe to be the most interesting aspect of this discussion, the gameplay. We will split this up into 5 parts: combat, puzzles and interactions, boss fights, pacing, and level design and general atmosphere. So let's start with the combat. As is often pointed out, combat is notoriously a bit of a weak point in the Half-Life series. When in fights, there is nothing you can do but take cover or simply pray people don't hit you. This is of course also how it works in real life, but generally makes for not so fun gameplay since there are no ways to peek around corners or whatever. The combat relies heavily on how the enemies are set up and spread out, since after that it just becomes a hit-scan shootout. The Half-Life games are very unforgiving in their combat, especially on higher difficulties. This all goes for both games, so let's get into what the games do right. Enemy placement is generally fair and fun. There is the occasional close quarter combat with the HECU soldiers equipped with SMG grenades in Half-Life 1, which can however also happen in Opposing Force with the Black Ops soldiers, though I did find this to be the case more rarely. Generally, I recommend to never introduce a grenadier enemy you have no chance of countering when you're making a game. The weapons in Half-Life 1 were mostly creative and versatile. The crossbow is a good example. It's a unique weapon with unique uses. One being that it can be used to kill faraway enemies, and it is great for killing the
Ichthyosaurus.
Yeah, that one. Some other weapons are rather useless or would be in need of a buff. The Snarks, for example, have very limited use cases due to them also attacking the player. The same goes for the Hornet gun. While it is great for the fact that it has infinite ammo, the use cases are pretty rare, even though it had a cool mechanic going with the whole tracking projectiles thing. Opposing Force is widely known for its many unique weapons. It features most weapons seen in Half-Life 1, while also adding a ton more new ones. 2 types of melees. The new alien weapons like the Shock Roach and Spore Launcher, the Displacer Cannon, which is to this day one of the greatest weapons I've ever seen in a game just for the secondary fire use case, and more ballistic weapons like the M249 or Desert Eagle. Don't worry, I'll get to the Barnacle Grapple later. One thing I would criticize about Opposing Force's weapons though is the fact that it's noticeable that they undershot the time to introduce these weapons. You might notice how the game, similar to Half-Life 1, starts by giving you a weapon every so often. They seem to have then realized they don't have that much time left and went into panic mode and added about 1 weapon per map for the last quarter of the game. It's not really that bad, though it does feel a little bloated too quickly. You will oftentimes end the game without having ever used one of the weapons except for right when you got them. Enemy variety is another point. Half-Life 1 introduced a ton of great enemies with a lot of variety and different mechanics. The soldiers, assassins, zombies, bull squids, hound eyes, vortigons, helicopters, headcrabs, gargantuas and more. All these make for great fights with a ton of variation. Generally, the combat in Half-Life 1 never gets boring. Opposing Force took this concept and added even more onto it by introducing a whole new race of aliens. This added the Gnome, Shock Trooper, Pit Drone, Voltigor, more Black Ops and even more. I think everyone is in agreement with saying that the combat is a lot more fun in Opposing Force, so this point goes to Opposing Force as well. Now onto puzzles and interactions. Puzzles are at the core of all Half-Life games. The Half-Life games are split up into 4 simple principles. These are mentioned in every single video essay-like video about Half-Life, but here I am saying them again. Run, think, shoot, live. The think part especially is part of what made Half-Life stand out amongst other FPS games. The puzzles are a nice break between the combat, be it pushing a crate or escorting a scientist from one point to another. The puzzles of Half-Life 1 are great and especially for its time were really innovative. They are fun and never really too frustrating for what I found. Opposing Force featured a lot less and also a bit less creative ones at most of the time. This mostly does fit with Opposing Force's theme of simply being a soldier, not a scientist. I did think a few of them were pretty good, but sometimes I'd find myself stuck for quite a while trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do, which is only fun for so long. Maybe this was just my stupidity though. I'd also like to mention the Barnacle Grapple here, which is an incredibly fun and creative weapon added in Opposing Force. Its greatness is however nullified in my opinion by the addition of ropes. They were used a total of like 2 times throughout the entire game. It felt like a very needless addition. Sure, they look cool and were quite a technological leap and a great achievement in the Gold Source engine. This does make up for the fact that they are pretty unneeded though. I generally dislike the ropes a bunch, which maybe I am the only person that thinks this way. We also quickly gotta mention squads. You can add scientists and security guards to your squad in Half-Life 1, which is great fun. Opposing Force extended this gameplay by making you able to add soldiers into your squad, specifically ones with different skills. Normal soldiers, medics or engineers which are able to open doors using blowtorches. Now, while this may seem really innovative, this is basically just splitting up the scientists and security guards. Scientists are able to heal you and open doors, and security guards can shoot for you. Obviously, the soldiers are more powerful though in Opposing Force. I wish the HUD system from Half-Life Field Intensity was part of Opposing Force. Field Intensity is a great mod that I made a video about recently, so go check that out if you want to. If Opposing Force had the squad HUD system of that game, I would honestly say it would win in this category. Overall, I gotta give it to Half-Life 1 though. It's only a very slight edge, so perhaps this remedies the looks point given to Opposing Force. Now, boss fights aren't really at the heart of Half-Life, I'd say, but they are very much noteworthy as they make up quite a big part of a lot of chapters of both games. I'm gonna first list what I consider to be bosses in both games for this discussion. Half-Life 1 will be the tentacles seen in Blast Pit, the Gargantua, the Gonarch, and of course, the Nihilinth. Opposing Force will be the Pitworm, that one tunnel filled with a ton of Voltigors, which is arguable if this is really a boss fight, and the Gene Worm. Starting with Half-Life 1, the tentacles are a very memorable enemy with revolutionary technology once again. Having an enemy that exclusively heals was, from all that I know at least, a first in gaming. While never fighting it one-on-one, navigating around it quietly made for one of the scariest and best experiences in all of gaming, especially at the time Half-Life released. The Gargantua is kinda the same concept, just a bit less fun I'd say. It's not as clear what you're supposed to do with the Gargantua, so while the Gargantua did appear earlier than the tentacles, I'd say it's a direct downgrade from the tentacle fight. The Gonarch is an interesting enemy. It looks absolutely horrid and the fight is rather monotonous. It's an interesting environment we fight in, and the arena changing every so often due to it continuing on running is a great idea. The baby headcrabs it spews out though are not that fun at all. Unless you are lucky enough to have a lot of SMG grenades here, these will be a pain to fight. The stuff it shoots at you is easy to dodge, which makes for a fair combat mechanic. So yeah, the Gonarch is fine overall, but not really that memorable. The Nihilinth is a pretty fun fight mostly. It does feel a little frustrating to keep on shooting at it without really seeing if you're doing damage. Getting teleported around and jumping up real high while dodging it shooting at you is fun though. And it has a great death sequence. Shooting at it with all you got, as your ammo will start to run out, feels rewarding and fun. So this fight overall is pretty great. Opposing Force features a lot less boss fights, but it is also a lot shorter of a game obviously. Starting with the Pitworm. It's basically just a mini version of the tentacle fight mixed with elements of the Gargantua fight. I really like the way it looks and it was cool to use the Barnacle grapple here. It's a good boss fight I'd say. Now the tunnel full of Voltigors is a different story. Now obviously this is not much of a boss fight per se, but I don't know how else to classify it. It's just an incredibly unfun, way too hard part of the game. You can just run through it if you know the path, but in case you don't, you are basically already dead. Perhaps it is just me, but I really dislike this part. It is a cool concept to have a tunnel infested with a bunch of the same alien, but maybe Voltigors shouldn't have been the chosen enemy. The Gene Worm is a mixed bag in my opinion. I generally love the way it looks, and it's fun that it keeps spawning enemies. The arena is really bland though, and it basically is just you running back and forth. It is nowhere near as good as a Nihilinth fight, as cool as a Gene Worm may look. So boss fights also has to go to Half-Life 1. For pacing, as I mentioned earlier, I feel that Half-Life 1 really missed the mark a bit on that one. While not too much of a problem, it did feel stretched at times, and definitely did so in Zen. The last two chapters are regarded as some of the worst chapters in its genre, especially in contrast to the greatness that is the entire Half-Life 1 campaign beforehand. The combat, puzzles and story beats were sometimes stretched far in between. For example, take the On a Rail chapter, which was basically completely cut from Black Mesa, the Half-Life 1 remake, because it's so unfun. It's obviously great to have a lot of playtime, but it's only good to a certain degree. Opposing Force, however, is rather short and a very meaty experience. There is no part where you're just running around not really doing anything or where there is nothing to be done. There is always either combat, a puzzle or some sort of conversation happening. This conversation can also just be between the soldiers you've added to your squad. Playing Opposing Forces is constant action, especially in the last third of the game, which is basically just non-stop combat. So this point has to go to Opposing Force. This also depends a bit on preference though, as do most things in this video. Some may enjoy the vast emptiness and size of the Black Mesa research facility being enhanced by longer stretches of nothing happening in Half-Life 1. For general fun gameplay though, Opposing Force does win this category. For level design and general atmosphere, we're not as much talking about looks but rather how well the levels are made gameplay wise. Being able to navigate the levels and the way the player has to move around the levels plays into this. Usually level design heavily involves looks, but I split off this category for this discussion, instead bundling only atmosphere into the level design. Half-Life 1 was, you guessed it, revolutionary in terms of level design. The Gold Source engine allowed for things never done before. Half-Life 1 used it to its full extent. The level design is not perfect at all. As mentioned, Zen for example has quite a few flaws. You'll find yourself unsure on if you can make a certain jump or where you're supposed to jump to, which is exactly what you should avoid in level design. You want the level to be clearly readable. Take this room for example. Once you enter it, you'll see a clear set piece you'll want to approach. The room is clearly readable and you see the path to continue. With this information immediately in mind, you will want to check out this room before moving on. Talking with the people here will reveal a lot of information about the facility and about the fateful test that will take place. Important world building that the player will go out of their way to explore without ever being told to do so. No icon telling you you're able to interact with them or invisible walls stopping you from going further until you've done something. Also no cutscene that just explains what is happening. This is perfect level design for a room where you want to tell a story. Another example would be this room. Once you enter, you see the path you want to go to, with a corridor leading around the corner, immediately awakening your curiosity. Though you are, as of right now, unable to get there. You then look down, which you automatically do due to the path in front of you pointing downwards, where you will see a brightly lit door. This immediately signals that your goal is to get to that door. The enemies placed in front of it are also immediately shown, and the bull squid gets introduced as a long-range enemy. Perfect level design for a puzzle/combat-based room. Now look at this. Very lackluster level design with little to no readability. The general atmosphere is still great though, even in Zen. It's nice to finally see it after hearing so much talk about it / seeing so many aliens from there. Opposing Forces atmosphere is really strong as well, featuring an almost constant battlefield. You do really feel like a soldier. The level design is great for the most part and does everything right, except for maybe a few hiccups. As I've mentioned, the pacing is also way quicker, which makes Opposing Force a lot meatier of a game. The level design plays to this as well, simply by being filled with constant action and fun. You might think I'd give Opposing Force a point on this one. There is however one very important thing that plays into atmosphere: music. Now, while Opposing Force does feature soundtracks of its own as well, they are nowhere near as vast and great as the magical performance that Kelly Bailey compressed into those MP3 files that are the Half-Life 1 soundtrack. I would love to inject each bit of the soundtrack right into my bloodstream. I'm not here to bash Opposing Force's soundtrack, but it's damn hard to compete with Half-Life 1 soundtrack, and it definitely lends Half-Life 1 the point here. This was the last category I said I would be rating the games on. So did Half-Life win? Kind of. Remember, we aren't even calculating for Half-Life revolutionizing the entire industry and it being the only reason Opposing Force is even able to exist. There is one more category though that we haven't yet factored in, one that shouldn't matter for a linear story game like Half-Life. Though due to this being the Half-Life community, in which we all just replay the same Valve games, we're going to have to take a look at replayability, starting with Half-Life 1. Half-Life 1 is definitely a fun game to replay, but what exactly are you looking for in a replay? I am not really here to learn a story, I already know it at this point. I'm also not here to learn about the vastness of the facility. While looks are obviously important and great and all, it is only part of the reason why you would replay this game. I don't think either of the two games really accounted for replayability, which is totally fine. I think Half-Life 1 is great to replay every so often, but you will find yourself frustrated at certain parts, especially at the puzzles, which are at the point of a replay merely a nuisance. Since Opposing Force does feature a lot less puzzles, features way faster paced action and a lot more fun combat with a lot of variety that can only really be explored by replaying it, given you receive like half of the arsenal near the end of the game, Opposing Force does receive the replayability point. This does mean it's a tie, though if you do really decide to account for replayability and ignore Half-Life 1's importance in the industry, I'd say the replayability factor actually makes Opposing Force the better game of the two by a very slight margin. So you have to decide what you think is important in a game. Personally, I think Half-Life is the better game, but I enjoy playing Opposing Force a lot more. Which brings me right to the exciting announcement mentioned in the intro. If you are watching this video today or one day after release, there is still time to join the Opposing the Bar event on August 13th at 3 PM GMT. We will try to come together to break the all-time concurrent players on Opposing Force. Right now, it's at 620 concurrent players. Which, come on, we can beat that easily. We will try to break 5,000 players, which is an ambitious goal, but with your help, we can do it. How do you join? Simply play Opposing Force. As pointed out, Opposing Force is really fun to replay. So at 3 PM GMT on August the 13th, meaning tomorrow, schedule yourself a replay. Here is a map of the time zones for 3 PM GMT. Take part by playing the game at that time. It will take you about 2 to 3 hours if you've played it before. I'd like to see each of you participate. Otherwise, thank you for watching.